Okay. Uh, Thank you very much. So I hope you had some coffee. Okay. So I hope you had some coffee and you had the opportunity to talk a little bit about bioenergy and, uh, and to drink some biomass. And now I have the great pleasure to announce the lecture from Professor Charles Kinoshita from University of Hawaii, one of our most senior experts in bioenergy. And we are very proud to have him here giving these lectures today with us. So Professor Charles, thank you very much for coming from so far from São Paulo to come here, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Swani. First of all, I'd like to thank the University of Sao Paulo for inviting me to be part of this school, especially Dr. Swani Coelho and Dr. Jose Simões Moreira. I really appreciate all the hospitality they gave us. And today I'm going to be making two presentations or giving two lectures. I'm going to give two lectures. The first one is, sorry, I didn't mean to show that. The first one is on, well, I'll discuss very briefly right here, in fact, what the first one is all about. And it's pretty much the front end of bioenergy. I'll first talk about something that you've already seen ad nauseum, the global energy consumption and bioenergy's consumption or contribution, which Dr. Coelho showed earlier. Then some potential benefits and drawbacks of bioenergy, again, which Swani talked about a little earlier. And then maybe depart a little bit, talk about some of the most important bioenergy factors that will help to hopefully advance bioenergy use worldwide and allow bioenergy to have a larger part of the energy mix. Then I'll talk about some of the energy crops that we've been looking at in Hawaii and elsewhere. And then bio-based heat and power. If I have enough time during the first session, I'll talk about first, second, third, and fourth generation biofuels, which we've had a lot of discussion about already. And then in the afternoon, I'll talk about other matters, primarily the conversion processes and so on for drop-in biofuels. You've already seen this in various iterations. I don't know if the numbers will be exactly the same as the earlier ones, but pretty much, this will tell the same story that renewables right now have a fairly modest contribution, although a growing one in the energy mix. Right here, using 2016 data from the World Bioenergy Association, renewables, which includes hydro, by the way, in this graph, make up about 18% of the total energy mix. And bioenergy is a significant contributor to that, in fact, the lion's share. Just showing you a couple of numbers, and they're not very clear here, but Brazil has a total energy consumption of a little more than 10% of what the United States consumes. So the United States is a tremendous consumer of energy, although I didn't realize it right now. In fact, we've been passed by China. But that's the consumption side. Now, the contribution of renewables, however, in the United States is only 8%, whereas in Brazil it's 43%. So the United States is lower in terms of its renewable energy contribution than the average for the world, and Brazil is much higher. So it's something that I think Brazil should be very proud of. In terms of taking a look at where we're going moving forward, certainly according to the World Bioenergy Association, which probably is painting a somewhat optimistic view of where bioenergy is going in terms of the energy mix, you can see that bioenergy is one of the few portions of the mix that is actually predicted to go up significantly. I'm sure that if you ask the Coal Association, they might have a different picture, but I believe, based on some of the things I see right now, including improvements in technology, about changes in rules, regulations, and policies, and concern about climatic effects, bioenergy probably, or renewables, is probably going to increase moving forward quite substantially. Okay, in terms of the U.S. energy consumption by source, and this is 2010 data, renewable energy made up only 8%. But what was interesting is that biomass, in fact, bioenergy made up the largest share of the United States renewable energy contribution, 53% in fact, in this data from the Department of Energy, I believe. So what kind of potential benefits do we have from bioenergy? Swani already mentioned some of those. Diversification of the energy mix, reducing our dependence on imported energy, and I'll talk about that in the Hawaii context quite at length. Support of agricultural and food processing industries, environmental benefits, and these are the ones that probably most people are familiar with. Reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, potential benefits to the ecosystem, although many would argue that in fact it's having exactly the opposite effect, and I'll probably talk about that more than the positive benefits. Improved air quality, especially if you're talking about ceasing open field burning of sugarcane or something like that, that would have a significant impact. Biodegradable fuels, that is, fuels that are bio-based are more biodegradable, so they pose a smaller threat to some of the ecosystem. Reduce landfills, I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then a very important one, socioeconomic benefits, regional and rural economic development, and employment opportunities. Now let me talk about some things in the Hawaii context, because we are a unique location. I hope many of you have visited in the past. We're the most remote populated landmass on Earth. There's no other place on Earth that you can find that is more remote from every place else. You can see here, all of our neighbors. Los Angeles, the closest one that I can point to there, is 4,000 kilometers away. And then everything else is much farther away. And then, of course, Sao Paulo, although it's not necessarily our neighbor, is 13,000 kilometers away. So we're far away from everything. We import almost everything we consume in the state. The two major things that we import are food, and more than 85% of our food is imported, and more than 85% of our energy resources that we consume in the state is also imported. So we're highly dependent on others for the very basic necessities in life, food and energy. Swani talked about this in depth. The one good thing about bioenergy is that it is carbon neutral. Well, I should go back to the last slide. The reason that is so important, or at least relevant, is that we are highly vulnerable to any kind of disruptions that we have in our supplies of food and fuel, and therefore having a indigenous source, something like bioenergy or other renewable energy sources that we can rely on, would help to protect us against any kind of disruptions that we might have. As everybody knows, bioenergy is carbon neutral, at least in theory. Of course, in practice, it's not so carbon neutral. It's more carbon neutral than many other forms of energy, but this is one of them that's fairly good. Bio-based power is almost carbon neutral. About 95% of all the carbon that's emitted is then taken up by the plants, and I should say only about 5% of the energy that goes into bioenergy production or power generation production is from fossil fuels. The rest pretty much is the closed loop that Dr. Coelho talked about. But not all biofuels or bioenergy sources are quite as, they're not all created equal. For example, if you look at some of these jet fuel pathways, bioenergy or biofuel jet fuel pathways, you'll notice that some of them are, in fact, not very complete in terms of closing the loop. Alcohol to jet fuel, for example, the greenhouse gas emissions are about half as much as you would have from conventional jet fuel produced from petroleum sources. Some of these other technologies, oil to jet fuel, gas to jet fuel, this would be syngas to jet fuel, and then sugar to jet fuel are much more efficient and rely much less on fossil energy inputs to produce those fuels. But they certainly are not, certainly not closing the loop completely by any stretch. One thing about biofuels or bioenergy that makes it somewhat unique when you take a look at renewable energy sources is that this is probably one of the few, and I think Eric will probably talk about this more tomorrow, that can actually sequester carbon, much more than the other alternative energy technologies. We all saw the scenario in which we close the loop on carbon dioxide, but in fact, some technologies, such as pyrolysis, for example, if we produce a significant amount of biochar and use that as a soil amendment, as much as 50% perhaps, could be tied up in the soil, almost becoming fossilized. Now, I don't know what the time frame is on that, but it's certainly a fairly long time frame in which you would be tying up carbon. So that's one attraction in bioenergy that is not really available to many of the other technologies. I talked about reduced landfill. In Hawaii, it's a major problem. We are running out of space to create new landfills. People don't want landfills to nearby them and so on. So quite recently, in fact for the last 10 years, we've been looking at the possibility of actually taking the garbage that we produce and shipping it off somewhere else, which is kind of tragic. We're creating a problem for California perhaps, that we generate, and that certainly isn't going to help any of our energy security or any other security. So we're looking at transporting up to about 100,000 tons of garbage a year to the West Coast, which is about 4,000 kilometers away. So, you can see the kind of additional carbon footprint we are looking at presenting here. It's not a solution. In fact, it's a bigger problem that we're creating by not being able to deal with our own garbage. I briefly talked about some of the socioeconomic benefits. We've done studies on the number of jobs that could be created using bioenergy farms, etc. And right here, I show you one of the species that we're looking at, bannergrass, which is an elephant grass or kind of a guinea grass, I guess, pretty much. Here we have a 7-month-old crop of bannergrass. It's a very fast-yielding energy cane type of system, and it has a productivity efficiency or photosynthetic efficiency considerably higher than sugarcane and lower water requirements than sugarcane. So this is an attractive crop for us. Right here, here I stand. I'm not very tall, but this is only a 2.3-month-old ratoon crop. So you can see how quickly this comes back. The plantation that we looked at was a 12,000-acre bannergrass plantation, and it created something on the order of about 185 jobs to run this, both in the field side as well as in the processing plant. I show here all the workforce requirements for a 6,000-hectare plantation, and basically we would be creating about 650 jobs. In Hawaii, that's a significant number of jobs that that we'd be looking at. So there are a lot of socioeconomic benefits in doing this, as opposed to just importing fossil fuels from other countries. And these, by the way, many of them are extremely high value jobs. I worked for the sugar industry for 10 years, so I feel very fondly about the value of being part of that industry. Now, there is an interesting development that's happened in Hawaii. We have a strong commitment to renewable energy. In fact, very recently, our governor signed a bill that sets a goal of 100% renewable energy. In fact, it's not a goal, it's a law. The utility companies have to convert over to 100% renewable energy by the year, it was 2045, somewhere, oh yeah, right here. 2045, 100% of the electricity sales by the utility companies have to come from renewable energy sources. We're the first state in the country, in fact, to adopt such a hefty goal. Now, of course, California, not wanting to be outdone by anybody in the United States, immediately after we set that goal, set the same goal themselves. And they're quite a bit larger than we are, about 40 times, I think. So I think that makes me somewhat optimistic that, in fact, that upward trajectory that you saw earlier in the growth of renewables is actually going to happen, because we'll see more and more states prompted by concern over, in our case, let me see, yeah, okay, 100% electricity sales, first state in the nation to set that goal. And the governor pointed out that the reason we're doing this is to improve our economy, our environment, and our energy security. All of those things that I mentioned earlier. Okay, but not everything is perfect. Bioenergy also has a number of potential problems associated with it. It has a relatively low efficiency in converting solar energy into usable energy end products. You folks took a look at PV earlier or heard about it. Many of you have signed up for that. PV systems are quite efficient, even though they have their limitations in converting insulation into commercial or usable energy. In biomass, the conversion rate is a lot lower. There's often a marginal energy output to input ratio, and Dr. Coelho talked about that in depth, and many of the questions that were posed this morning talk about that issue. A major one right now is a concern over food versus fuel, and Swati touched upon that as well. And obviously, there's a potential negative impact on biodiversity and the ecosystem that we can't ignore. But much of it depends, as Dr. Coelho mentioned, in the type, in your management system, how you manage your cropping systems. Yeah? Okay, the first one, low conversion efficiency. I guess there's a saying universally that the only things in life that are certain are death and taxes. And it turns out that in bioenergy systems or in plants, in fact, it's the same thing. They have to face death and taxes. Taking a look at the solar energy that comes in solar energy that's incident at ground level. Okay, forget about all the stuff that's reflected or these days more absorbed. Out of that 100% of the solar radiation that's incident on Earth, immediately about half of it is taxed because it's really outside of the photosynthetic active region for biomass. Yeah? It's outside of this sweet spot, 400 to 700 nanometers, which is the only part that plants can actually photosynthesize. So we lose half of it right there. We also have incomplete absorption. We have some wavelength mismatch that all contribute to losses or taxes that are taken off the top before the plant can actually use it. Then there's inefficient conversion of ATP and NADP. These are cofactors that convert the sunlight and carbon dioxide or carbon into glucose molecules. Coming further down, As it gets into the plant, we have other losses that occur, and it really depends on whether these are C4 plants or C3 plants. The distinction is that the C3 plants go through some type of three-carbon pathway before the carbon is photosynthesized into glucose, and the C4 path uses a four-carbon pathway before it goes into the plant. So once it is photosynthesized and the glucose is created, we still have losses. One very important one, or significant one, that mainly is a problem with C3 plants is that C4 plants have, because of their metabolism, have found ways to in fact shut down their photorespiration rate so they don't lose energy in the process at night, etc. Whereas C3 plants continue to do that, which means that eventually, as you get all the way down, the C3 plants are not as highly efficient photosynthetically as the C4 plants might be. So, cascading downwards, going through the tax system, beginning with 100 units of insulation that reaches the earth, the ground level, only 4.6% could be theoretically used or converted into plant material, energy, in C3 plants, and only 6% in C4 plants. Now, these numbers are highly deceptive because they grossly overestimate how much, in fact, the plants are absorbing and using. Nevertheless, if I use these two numbers, the 4.6% and the 6%, they would translate to theoretical yields of about 130 tons per hectare a year in biomass energy for C3 plants, and 180 tons per hectare a year for C4 plants, okay, at least theoretically speaking. You'll see later that the actual performance is much, much less than that. By the way, C3 plants are those that make up about 95% of all the plants in the world. There are trees, for example, large leaf plants. The C4 plants are typically grasses such as sugarcane, etc., which are highly efficient. Okay, now the problem with these low yields, okay, is that, of course, if you're going to have some type of conversion facility, you're going to have to draw in all your biomass from different locations, and the lower your yield is, the farther out you're going to have to go to harvest your biomass and transport it. And it turns out that transportation of your feedstock is a fairly significant cost component when you take a look at the total cost of delivering and processing biomass. I think probably around 15% or so, and could be much greater than that if you have to go much further out. For example, if you had a perfect plantation that were completely circular and your conversion facility was right in the middle, you'd be looking at a transportation cost that's proportional to the transportation distance, which would be inversely proportional to the square root of the yield, okay? Now, that's if you had a perfect plantation. A few years ago, I took a look at 2 biomass plantations in the state of Hawaii, and the first one, which is on the island of Oahu, had a fairly nice configuration. You can see here, while not circular, it's fairly, it looks fairly efficient in terms of its shape. If you had a conversion facility, for example, right here, you can see that probably, if you kind of close your eyes a little bit, that perhaps the cost would be inversely proportional to the square root of the distance. The other one that I looked at, which was a much larger plantation, both of these were owned by the same company, is not as conveniently configured. This is on the Big Island along the Hamakua coast, and it stretches for around maybe 50 kilometers across. And unfortunately, while it was in sugarcane, the sugarcane factory was right here. So you can see that in that case, the cost is not going to be inversely proportional to the square root. It's probably going to be inversely proportional to the actual yield, okay? So if you're here and your costs are, well, let me go back to the last one. Where, for example, in this particular case, if you had a circular plantation and your yield were you're 50 tons per acre or hectare year, your cost might only be about $2.30. If your yield were instead much more typical of many non-tropical species at 10 tons per hectare a year, your cost would be $5 per ton, significantly more. If you're in a plantation that's not so well configured, you can imagine that instead it would be $10 per ton harvested. So that is a problem with biomass because the yield is relatively low. The other thing that's always been a concern with bioenergy is the energy output to input ratio. For biofuels, it hasn't been impressive in many cases. Dr. Coelho talked about, for example, corn ethanol. And here you can see, in fact, maybe 30 years, 40 years ago, it turns out that corn ethanol had a negative, energy input to output. In fact, it was running into deficit. It probably took 1.2 gallons of fossil fuels to produce 1 ethanol equivalent, 1 gallon ethanol equivalent or gasoline equivalent of ethanol. That has improved. The blue is the energy input. The red is the energy output, the ethanol energy output from corn. And you can see that at least the relative differences in those two, it's getting bigger. And right now you're looking at probably 1.5 or so. And if you add some of the byproduct credits, you can see that it's over 2, but not that impressive overall. By contrast, and here are some of them, I think Swani even has this graph in her presentation tomorrow, with corn, sugar beets, and wheat. The energy balance is not so great. Corn 1.4, wheat 2.0, but sugarcane is really one of the most efficient crops in terms of having a good energy output to input ratio. And part of it is because the energy inputs are fairly reasonable, and the productivity of the crop is so extremely high. In fact, I think this data came from this university. Moving on, the food versus fuel challenge is a significant concern. If you take a look at the arable land use per person, universally, whether you're talking about North America, Europe, Central America, Central Asia, etc., South Asia, the world right here, the amount of arable land that we have available to us per person is continuing to drop, partly because we're losing some of that land, but mostly because our population keeps increasing. So, we're going to have a hard time just feeding people in the future. And now if we're going to have to then set aside a lot of that acreage for energy crop plantations, we're going to have a much bigger challenge in trying to feed and fuel our population. Now, one promising thing, at least note, is that if we go to second generation fuels, okay, which don't rely on food crops, they tend to be a lot more stable in terms of their pricing than some of the food crops, which are highly volatile. For example, looking at the last 10 years or so, you can see that in the case of palm oil and sugar, the prices have been highly volatile, and some have argued that some of the price spikes that we've seen in the past have been due to conversion of some of these food crops into energy uses. By contrast, if you take a look at hard logs, during that same period, the price has been relatively stable. Now, I'm not saying that it's necessarily because this is not a food crop, but more than likely that was a factor in terms of at least tempering the volatility of the prices over the years. In terms of biodiversity or diversity in general, that's very important in Hawaii. We are, I think, one of the most diverse locations on Earth. We're very small, but in fact, within our small state, we have 11 of 12 soil orders, so we're almost the entire world in terms of our soils. And we're 10 out of 14 climatic zones. We're one of the few places where, in fact, you can snow ski and then go snorkeling probably with a 2-hour drive, we're highly diverse, and that is very important to us. However, we have been very unfortunate in terms of our diversity or our endangered species, for example. This is something that came out of the Huffington Post. Wow, it was updated only less than 1 year ago. And the title was Hawaii is the Endangered Species Capital of the World. It says here Hawaii makes up less than 0.2% of the US land, but over 25% of the species found in the nation's endangered species list are in fact part of Hawaii. So, we have a disproportionately large number of species that are being threatened for extinction. So we are concerned about that. We feel that there is some bit of optimism, on the other hand, taking a look at Brazil, for example. We see here that their sugar industry makes up only about 2.8% of the total arable land area, and there's still a significant amount, about 30%, that is available for expansion if you went into biofuels for the sugar industry. In fact, much more than the sugar industry holds right now. What is somewhat more, I think, optimistic is that, or at least gives me reason for optimism, is if you take a look at the conversion efficiency of ethanol per hectare in Brazil, it has increased quite substantially. Right now, it's at, whereas it used to be about 4,000, now it's over 8,000 liters per hectare a year. So with continuous improvements in efficiency, hopefully the size or the footprint of the sugar industry doesn't have to increase. They can absorb much of that with increased efficiency and new technologies. Okay, and then finally, impact on biodiversity and the ecosystem. Energy crops, particularly C4 species, have high water requirements. For example, and I think Swani talked about sugarcane water use. I got to applaud Brazil for its efficiency in terms of using water. In Hawaii, when we had a sugar industry, which by the way closed down last year, our last mill went out of production. When I started working in the sugar industry, we had about close to 200,000 acres, and last year we're down to 0. And part of it is because of the way I think we used to grow sugarcane. Swani mentioned that most of the sugarcane here, at least in the Sao Paulo area, is rain-fed. In Hawaii, that wasn't the case. Most of our plantations that in fact survived were irrigated plantations. And it turns out that sugarcane, not surprisingly, being a C4 plant, is a very thirsty plant. It consumes about 1,000 kilograms of water for 1 kilogram of dry matter. So, so if you're irrigating your fields, you're going to have to pay for all that water. Just as an example, the 2 plantations I showed you earlier, we did an analysis for the company that owns that land, and they wanted to go into ethanol production, and we noted that in one case on the Hamakua coast, the amount of rainfall was very high. I mean, I think on that plantation they have about 80 inches a year. I can't make the conversion here, but and so the amount of applied water irrigation water was very low. By contrast, the other location on Oahu needed about half of its water to be applied through irrigation. And basically, from an economic standpoint, what it meant was, depending on how much the water cost, and we do have to pay for that water, by the way, to use that water. If we went to the worst case scenario, $1 per 1,000 gallons of water that we use. In the case of this Kauai Loa plantation, the cost of just the water alone to irrigate the sugarcane or energy cane would have been 61% of the value of the ethanol that we produce. I mean, just for the water, okay? Now, for the Hamakua location, where in fact most of the water is rain-fed, the impact is much smaller. Even at the highest cost for water, it would just represent 26%, but that's still a significant cost factor. So we've taken a look in Hawaii at a whole host of different types of energy feedstocks. In fact, much of my life was spent in looking at these and trying to evaluate them for their efficacy, how efficient, how they were in terms of producing biomass. Some of the crops that we looked at, eucalyptus, of course, is very big in Brazil. Some of the tropical hardwoods are Lucena, Casuarina, etc. We took a look at all of those, and those were all tropical hardwoods. Bannergrass, the one I showed you earlier, the scenario that we looked at for one of the plantations, that very tall grass with very high yields. We tried that on Oahu, grew about 1,000 acres of that. Energy cane, we grew that on Maui, tried that for a while, with very, very high yields, by the way. And then most recently, we have worked with a private company in looking at pangamia. I don't know if Brazil grows any pangamia. It's a nut crop, oil nut crop, and the yields of pangamia are extremely high, not quite as high as perhaps palm oil, but probably higher than almost any other. Jatropha, I think it's higher than Jatropha. So that looks very promising, and because there's the possibility of producing an animal feed byproduct, we're quite excited about that. And then, of course, microalgae. We have, or at least at one time, we had one of the largest microalgae farms in the world. No longer, of course, because there are some very big ones coming up now. And we looked at all of these different crops for their productivities, et cetera, their yields. And so moving along, what are the important points or factors in bioenergy? Well, we have important factors that deal with the feedstock, important factors that deal with the conversion, and then important factors that are relevant to the final end product. As far as the biomass feedstock goes, of course, biomass yield, properties, and the feedstock costs are very important. Probably feedstock cost is the most important. Intermediate or in between, in terms of the conversion yield, of course, is important, the conversion efficiency, but again, the conversion cost is what really determines whether something is going to be viable. And then finally, on the back end, the value of the energy product and any kind of byproducts that we can get out of this is important. Our feeling is that unless we can produce a byproduct, none of these are going to be viable, at least not in the short term. And then underlying all of that, of course, are the environmental, social, and other factors which we need to consider. Let's talk about feedstock costs only for a second. It turns out that biomass really isn't that expensive a feedstock when you compare that against the incumbent. Fuel oil at $70 a barrel, and that's the number I found about 10 days ago for the cost of fuel oil, translates to $11.70 per gigajoule. If I had to harvest trees or bannergrass or something like that and deliver it to a plant at $100 a dry ton, $100 a dry ton, which is, by the way, quite a bit higher than most studies assume it'll cost. My assumption, it will cost that much. Okay? But that still translates to only half the cost of fuel oil in terms of your feedstock cost. Okay? So inherently, I think biomass has kind of an advantage over fuel oil in terms of being a fairly cheap feedstock to use. Now, there are many other issues, of course, that might turn the tables, and the conversion costs are extremely high, and there might be some gross inefficiencies in the conversion as well. Okay. Some of the important properties in biomass, I talked about them. The first one is moisture content. If you took a look at just combustion, for example, in the use of a boiler, you can see here that most, maybe trees and biomass feedstocks are somewhere between 50 and 70% moisture content, and already you can see a significant decrease in the theoretical efficiency that you would have in terms of that. So it does impact your energy conversion quite significantly. Even worse in terms of gasification, if you took a look at the raw feedstock again at 50% to 70% moisture content, what you'll see is that the parasitic energy that goes into this, the amount of heat that has to go into just gasifying the biomass, would represent somewhere between 30% and 65% of the energy in the gas that you produce. So, moisture content is always an enemy of efficiency. We have to get rid of that. But there are ways, of course, mechanically dewatering it or drying it that might help to abate some of that. Secondly, the proximate and ultimate analysis, that is the amount of carbon, volatiles, ash that you have, which is a proximate analysis. The ultimate analysis, which would be the chemical constituents, the main ones being carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur, and the higher heating value are all important things when you're trying to consider the value or what is a good biomass feedstock. Right here I show in red typical values of the proximate and ultimate analysis for biomass feedstocks, and I compare those against, for example, solid fuels and against liquid fuels. And you'll see that there are dramatic differences. The energy content is much lower in biomass. The oxygen content is very high. And all of those present some real problems in terms of converting that efficiently into some of the things, the end products that we want to produce. Let's see. Okay, recalcitrant properties. That is things that are just going to be a real pain to work with when you're trying to convert this either thermochemically or biologically into a fuel. Some of the things that are very bad in biomass, in fact in bannergrass, the thing that I showed you earlier, if you harvested bannergrass, you'll find that the amount of potassium oxide in it is extremely high, 45.9 compared to 13.4% of ash on a mass basis is potassium oxide. The problem with potassium oxide, as well as chlorine and so on, which is also high in some of these biomass feedstocks, is that if you sent it through a thermal conversion process, what often happens, say a combustion process or a gasification process, the potassium will volatilize, and then as it goes towards the back end of your conversion system, it'll recondense because you're always trying to take the temperature out of that. And once it recondenses, it presents a real problem. As long as it's gasified, it's not a problem. It'll flow very nicely. But if it recondenses, and then it'll start trapping all of the particulates, etc., and then you'll have fouling problems in your product. So we've been spending quite a bit of time looking at ways of trying to get rid of all of these recalcitrant materials. Much of the work that we did at the University of Hawaii has dealt with gasification of biomass, different types of biomass, including bagasse and bannergrass. And the things that most of it, or much of it, was on trying to get rid of all of these problem constituents. For example, on bench scale gasification, we've taken a look at reducing tars, that is all the oils, compounds that are in the product gas, as well as the alkaline materials that I talked about, potassium oxide and so on, which are problematic. Also tracking nitrogenous species. Many of the species that we have are nitrogen fixing, and we want to use them as feedstocks. The problem with that is if you're going to use it in a combustion process, for example, now you've got fuel-bound nitrogen that could produce NOx and create a real environmental problem, a pollution problem. Suwani alluded to a gasifier project that I was hired at the University of Hawaii to go after, which we did succeed in getting as a state, and it was a scale-up facility designed to handle about 100 tons per day, and we sited it at a sugar plantation. Much of the work that we did there was targeted at doing hot gas cleanup, trying to clean up the material at a hot stage before things recondense, grabbing the particles before they become a problem on the back end. I'll talk about that a little bit. So that's on the thermochemical conversion side. On the biological conversion side, some of the important properties are on the biochemical side are the lignocellulosic structure, and I'll talk about that in a second, as well as the chemical composition, which, come to think of it, I won't talk about at all. If you take a look at plant cell walls, what you'll see is the plant consists of three different types of cellulosic material. Cellulose is a fairly significant component. It makes up about maybe 35 to 40% of plant biomass, depending on what kind of species you're talking about. Hemicellulose makes up probably about another 30%, and then lignin makes up usually about 30%. Cellulose is a long chain of glucose molecules, just chained along. Hemicellulose is a long chain of pentose molecules, 5-carbon sugars, hexoses, and then lignin is just kind of a mess of stuff, and it's the thing that gives plant its structure, so it has the ability to at least stand up, etc. If we try to convert this into ethanol today, and they're doing that right in Brazil right now, I believe is what Suwani alluded to. You can hydrolyze biomass, break out the cellulose portion, convert that into glucose, and using yeast that make alcohol in beer or anything else for that matter in ethanol, you can use conventional yeast to convert that glucose into ethanol. Okay. The hemicellulose is a little more problematic. In the past, what happened was most of the yeast that we had, the conventional commercial yeast, weren't good at converting the xylose portion, the 5-sided sugar portion, into ethanol. So we had to find ways to find new organisms or genetically engineer new organisms that would take the 5-sided sugar and produce ethanol out of it. And I'll show you in a second what, pretty neat stuff went on to actually genetically engineer bacteria instead of yeast to then do what yeast do to other sugars, that is, produce ethanol. The lignin portion is something that it's kind of a hot mess. We don't want to work with it, but it turns out that every type of conversion process you have in the universe almost requires a certain amount of process heat, so we can always use the lignin, which would be the residual material that's left behind in order to produce the process heat that we need. Let me just show you some yields of selected energy crops that most of these are data from Hawaii. Napier grass and banner grass and so on the fiber yield is about 47 tons per hectare a year. At least that's what we're projecting on a commercial basis. Sorghum, 22, miscanthus, 22, and then it goes down. Switchgrass, we don't grow any in Hawaii, but on the mainland, this is a temperate crop, and that's probably the one that most of the U.S. is looking at its energy crop. It has a fairly low yield of about 16 tons per hectare a year. Eucalyptus is somewhat better, but not much, 18, a C3 plant, and then pine is only 9. Sugarcane sugar, okay, just the sugar portion, has a yield of about 9 tons per hectare a year. Beets about the same. Sorghum a little lower, and then corn starch is about 6 tons per hectare a year. If you take a look at the oil crops, they're even lower yet. Okay, plants apparently don't produce oil all that well. Oil palm about 5 tons per hectare a year. Jatropha 1.6, rapeseed 0.4, soybean 0.4. I think the pangamia that we're looking at, we would project be probably around 2.5. So we're very excited about that. But you can see that that's much lower than the kind of yields you would get from fiber or sugar crops. I want to point out, as I did earlier, that the theoretical yields that we would get out of C3 plants were about 130 tons per hectare a year, and C4 plants 180. So you can see that there's a significant difference even between our most efficient plants, say Napier grass or bannergrass or something like that, at about 50 versus what it should theoretically be 180, okay? So whereas these were producing at a yield of about 3 to 5% total efficiency, you can see that what we're getting is about 1% or even lower. And when you compare that against, this is something different, but when you compare that against photovoltaics, which is 10 to 20%, there's a big gap between bioenergy and photovoltaics. By the way, even though I pointed out that we're only producing about 30% of what we theoretically could produce, I do point out that some work done by people here at University of Sao Paulo, for example, have indicated that in sugarcane at least, anywhere from 13% to 23% of the dry matter is underground, which we never harvest. So those don't appear in our numbers. Yeah? Okay. Now I'm going to depart from this and finally talk about conversion systems, and Swani or Jose, let me know when I'm running out of time. And talk first about combined heat and power. And this refers to cogeneration or concurrent generation of electricity or mechanical power and thermal energy, heating or cooling, from a single source of energy. And I got to say that probably the oldest industry maybe in the world that took advantage of cogeneration was the sugar industry. And it does so, at least in today's terms, something like this. You've got your bagasse fuel, or your sugar cane comes in, it's milled to extract sugar. The residual fiber that's left behind is the bagasse. It's burnt in a boiler to produce steam at fairly high pressures. That steam then, at high pressure, goes into a turbo generator and is extracted at several different pressures. These different pressures are designed for different uses. A high pressure stream comes out and it is used to run many of the mechanical pieces of equipment, the mills being the major parasitic requirement for energy or power in the factory. But there are other units, pumps, fans, and so on to run the boiler system and so on, are all use that high pressure steam. Lower pressure steam, about 1 bar, about 1 bar or gauge is used to process sugar. okay, to evaporate the water that's in the sugarcane juice. And it turns out that that's a very significant requirement in the sugar factory, and I'll show you something on that in a second. And then finally, a small portion, about usually 30% or so, goes all the way to the end to very low pressures, typically 2 inches of mercury, so that's about 1 PSIA for those who are engineers, at very low pressure, vacuum pressure, and that goes into a condenser, and pretty much all of that then closes the loop, and it goes round and round and round. This whole system is really quite ingenious and has been used for a long time. In fact, I believe Hawaii was the first place to use electric power generation from sugarcane. I remember looking in some of the archives when I worked for the sugar industry, and only about 20 years after, in fact, electricity became commercial, was first used ever commercially by a utility power plant, the Hawaiian sugar industry installed fairly significant size turbo generators and boilers and so on. In fact, at one point I recall seeing that Hawaii had the highest pressure boilers and turbo generators in the world. I have some kind of question for some of you, those of you who are engineers or non-engineers. I showed you what we have here. We harvest sugarcane. Earlier I talked about that. Then we express the juice out. And then to help in the expression, that is in the extraction process of getting that sugar out of the fiber, we actually add more water so we can help the extraction of that sugar out. We want to try to recover as much sugar as we can. And that sugarcane juice goes into the back end of the factory and then has to be boiled in order to produce sugar at the end. So we have to get rid of a lot of water. In fact, the amount of water that we have to get rid of is about 1 ton of water for every ton of sugarcane that comes in. And you got to remember that the sugarcane comes in at about 70% water. So, there's a lot of water there inherently, and then we add more water on top of it. It turns out that 1 ton of sugarcane has 0.14 tons of bagasse fiber, which has a potential energy yield, once you try to convert that into steam and usable energy, of about 1,740 megajoules, okay? This is a problem for the class. Now, that 1,740 megajoules of process heat has to evaporate 1 ton of water. That 1 ton of water is liquid, and in order to get into a vapor phase, needs at the very least 2260 megajoules is the latent heat of vaporization. That is, you have to put in that much energy to evaporate the water, okay? In addition to that, I have to run mill equipment, this and other pieces of equipment. That's not even generating a kilowatt hour of exportable electricity, okay? By the way, in Hawaii, we used to generate about, I think, 100 kilowatt hours per ton. So we generated a lot of electricity out of sugarcane. And we were by far the most efficient in the world. But that's just the power needed to run the mills and so on, translated to 54 megajoules. So you can see that when you add these two up, they're much greater than the amount of energy that we have in the fiber. Yeah? Okay? Now the question I have to you is, how the heck did we do that? And we've done that for a long time. Anybody have any ideas? Okay, I'll show you. The way we did that is we would use what we call multiple effect evaporators, and that was invented quite a long time ago, okay? And I'll show you how it works, but anyway, the inventor, let me talk about this. The operating pressure and corresponding, by the way, I'm taking this out of my class in unit operations, so I don't know if it's written too well. Operating pressure and corresponding saturation temperature drops in each successive vessel, allowing the vapor from one vessel, okay, to heat the solution in the next vessel, thereby increasing the amount of liquid evaporated per unit of external heating medium for example, steam. I know it's a mouthful, but basically what we do is we take whatever is evaporated from the first evaporator, put it into the second evaporator, drop the pressure, and if all of you remember your thermodynamics, you would know that as you drop the pressure, the saturation temperature comes down, so the solution will boil at a lower temperature. So what you can do is you take the vapor from the first one, you put it into the second one. The second one has a lower pressure, which has a lower temperature, saturation temperature, so all of it starts evaporating again. So you just keep tricking the thing along the way. And this ingenious thing was developed in 1843 by a person, an African-American engineer who was working in Louisiana, Norbert Rilot. He was the one who invented the multiple effect evaporator, and it was first used, in fact, in the sugar industry, not surprisingly. Now, of course, it's used in almost every industry that has evaporation requirements. Just to show you what I have in my class, in fact, even the homework problems that I gave them. Again, what you do is you take steam, you evaporate the first vessel, and you produce vapor, then you use that to heat the second vessel, and you get new vapor, then you use it to heat the third vessel. So in a sense, what you can do is 1 unit of steam could, in theory at least, evaporate 5 units of water if you use a quintuple or 5 effect evaporator. This is really ingenious and helped us, in fact, become highly energy self-sufficient. Okay, last thing I'm going to talk about, at least in this section, is how do we get better if we were in the sugar industry, just using that as a prototypical system that uses combined heat and power. Well, we could go from the old system that I showed you, which was basically having a boiler and a turbo generator, and then extracting steam at various locations, using that to run systems, and then generating electricity, both for internal use and external use, and then sending a portion of the steam over to the processing end to evaporate the water. We could go into a gasifier combined cycle system, which was what we wanted to do when we worked on our sugar gasifier project on Maui. And conceptually, it looks like this. You have your bagasse again coming in, you dry it, and then you put it into a gasifier, which then produces some type of product gas. It's at fairly high temperatures, and it's laden with all types of particulates. We would then send it into some type of cyclone on the front end to remove the heavy particles, then into a tar cracker to try to break up any of the tars and oils so we no longer have condensables. Go into then a hot gas filter and try to trap out all of the particulates before we send them downstream. Once we get out of the hot gas filter, we would then put it into an alkali getter that would get rid of the potassium oxide and other things like that. And then cool it down a little bit before we put it into the combustor for a gas turbine system. So it would go into the combustor and generate electricity. Now, of course, we could take a portion of that and send it into a fuel cell if we wanted to. We would have, if we have the right concentration of hydrogen. And then once we have the hot gases coming out of the back end of the gas turbine, put it into a heat recovery steam generator, and that would then produce electricity in a steam turbine. And again, as in the classical sugar plantation, we would take an intermediate pressure steam, use it to run our mills, take the low pressure steam, use it to run our juice processing, evaporate our juice, for example. Okay. And then finally, this would come out the condensing side to generate electricity. Running out of time? Okay, I've got one more slide. It has the advantage of increasing electricity generation efficiency by about 50% and reducing our costs by about 30%. And this is the project that we had and a conceptual one. Okay, I'll quit right here.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is something that our sugarcane companies are after. Uh, do you have any commercial ones that are really working? And
No.
yeah, that's
No. Our project ended with loss of funding and so on. So,
Yeah.
you know, I don't know, Eric, you know of any gasifier-based power generation system right now? I mean, there have been demonstrations that have operated successfully, but I don't know about sugarcane.
Yeah, there aren't any commercial operations today. There have been two or three successful
Yeah,
demonstration scale,
demonstrations,
but
yeah.
they're too expensive to keep running. So
You know, and that's the problem, as Swanee pointed out. Some of these have the promise of being highly efficient, but you know, making that transition from this to that is often very costly, and when you have you know, a first failure or lack of complete success, and everybody gets discouraged, no funding, and then. You know. So have I run out of time, by the way? Oh, okay. Okay, then I'll back up a second and go back here. Yes, this is the project that we had at one of our sugar mills, and this was a 20 megawatt BIGCC, I think, Biomass Integrated Gasifier Combined Cycle system. And pretty much, I already showed you the schematic of what it looked like, but we would take the gas again and then send it to the gasifier, clean it up, use it in a gas turbine on the front end. The hot gases would go into a steam turbine on the back end, so we would have a combined cycle, and we could increase the efficiency quite substantially before we then go back through the loop again. Okay, I'm going to end today's presentation by having some discussion on first, second, and third, and fourth generation biofuels. And I put this in the back end of this presentation and on the front end of the next one because I didn't know whether I would have enough time. But we've heard a lot about first and second generation biofuels, and I'm very impressed by, in fact, the knowledge that you have on this. But you know, let me go over those four anyway, even though many of you seem to know maybe more than I do about it. On the first generation biofuels, which we'll call conventional biofuels, these were produced from food crops grown on lands that normally would be used for food crops, prime agricultural lands. And they consisted of largely, and Swanee did a good job already in giving you the information on this, vegetable oils, canola, palm oil, etc., and starch or sugar. This would be corn in the United States, sugarcane in Brazil, that were converted into biodiesel or ethanol using, in the case of biodiesel, transesterification, or in the case of ethanol, yeast fermentation. And these first generation biofuels were criticized for a number of reasons, and I talked about some of them earlier. Number one, they had, at least they were viewed to have marginal environmental benefits. Now, I gotta say that, Brazil's ethanol program is probably an exception to that because of the high output to input ratio. I already talked about the problem with corn ethanol. It is making significant increases or improvements, but in fact still it's not great. And especially it was criticized for placing food in competition with fuel because, as I said, these were produced from food crops, grown on lands that were intended to be used for food production. So, when you start diverting some of that land over to fuel production, it becomes kind of a problem. These are the first two that are the most widely known, and this would be conversion of plant oil or even animal fat through transesterification into biodiesel. And biodiesel is basically mixed with gasoline, with regular diesel. fuel in the U.S. Yeah? It can't be used as a standalone fuel. Sugarcane and corn are either starch or the sugars. The starch would be converted into sugars and then fermented using yeast into ethanol. And unlike in Brazil, in the United States, of course, that's always mixed with gasoline. We don't have any neat ethanol or regular ethanol cars, although that's always surprised me because the conversion over to a flex-fuel vehicle is fairly simple, so it shouldn't be hard, but the U.S. has never chosen to do that, probably because we could never produce that much anyway. The process for converting ethanol from sugar and biodiesel from oils and fats are shown here. In the case of ethanol, we take glucose, sugar, convert that into pyruvate, and these are then converted further before they are transformed into 2 molecules of ethanol, and we release 2 molecules of carbon dioxide. The process is fairly efficient, and the end products are, of course, ethanol, which is a fuel, and carbon dioxide, which is a gas, but at least it's at the lowest energy state. I mean, you understand that whenever you're using carbon and hydrogen, your ultimate goal is to try to get to the lowest state, which would be carbon dioxide and water vapor, or liquid water. So it's it's there, and so that's pretty efficient. In terms of biodiesel from oils or fats, I take 1 part of oil or fat, and in the presence of a catalyst, add 3 parts of some alcohol, mostly methanol is used, and that is converted into glycerol or glycerin, and then I get 3 units of methyl esters or biodiesel out of that, fatty acid methyl ester, FAME, or biodiesel. So the conversions kind of look like that. Here's 1 molecule of glucose producing 2 molecules of carbon dioxide waste and 2 molecules of ethanol. Here, 1 molecule of oil, whatever that means. There's really no molecule of oil. 3 molecules of alcohol producing 1 molecule of glycerin and 3 molecules of something that looks like biodiesel. Both of those are very efficient processes, but in fact, as I pointed out earlier, they do rely on things that normally would be food crops and therefore are highly criticized as not being ideal types of fuels. So we move on, and many of you have already shown me that you know what second generation biofuels look like. These are produced from lignocellulosic biomass, agricultural residues, or waste plant material, and hopefully if they're grown as dedicated crops, okay, energy crops, they could be grown on lands that are not targeted for cultivating food, on more marginal lands than in our prime agricultural lands. And hopefully, unlike the experience in Hawaii and sugarcane, they would not consume large amounts of water or fertilizer in their production. So the examples of these feedstocks are energy crops, agricultural residues and green waste, MSW, black liquor, which is a residue left behind in pulping operations and so on. Questions now? Oh, okay.
My name is Raquel. I'm here from Brazil. And about the first and also the second generation biofuels, here in Brazil, because we have this land problem, we need either to increase the yields or have more land for grow the crops. So we are discussing a lot here, like about using degraded grasslands, or also having like confined livestock, so you have more land for growing the crops. And I would like to know, like in Hawaii or in the U.S., like how is that, like options? Are people discussing what's the perspective of these options there?
Well, number one, we don't produce any ethanol from from fiber, so unlike Brazil. So we don't have any experience with that. But in terms of collecting residues, we have, in some cases, sugarcane, for example, in some cases gone to collecting sugarcane trash, which would normally be burnt and then would create some emissions problems and so on, and brought that back to the factory and processed that for electricity generation. So we've been trying to do some of that. It's largely a cost issue, yeah, and also it's largely an issue of dealing with regulations. In many cases, we did that because we were forced to do that. The neighbors who lived around sugar plantations, they didn't like open field burning, so that forced us to, in some cases, at least when the wind was blowing in the wrong direction, harvest the entire crop, bring it back, and then process the trash. In Hawaii, not so much, using plant residues, but of course we have for a long time taken much of the municipal solid waste that we have and converted that into electricity. In fact, on Oahu, the most populated island in the state, 70% of the population in the state lives on Oahu. All of the municipal solid waste that is generated from residential places are treated and used in generating electricity. So we try to do that. In the future, I can see that becoming even more common. Did that answer your question? More or less? Maybe a little bit. Okay, and then examples of conversion processes: syngas catalysis, syngas to liquids using Fischer-Tropsch, biocatalysis, hydrothermal upgrading are the ones that are most common for drop-in fuels. I don't show here, sugarcane fiber, for example, conversion, because that doesn't produce a drop-in biofuel. A digression for a second on that last one. Dr. Coelho talked about the conversion of sugarcane bagasse into ethanol, the fiber into ethanol, and for a long time that's been a possibility using kind of the process I talked about earlier, which was to break up the sugarcane fiber into cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin, taking the cellulose fraction, which is a long chain of glucose molecules, and breaking that up and using that with just regular yeast to produce ethanol. Interestingly, about 20 years ago, what happened was patent number 5 million, and just coincidentally, or maybe by design, US patent number 5 million was a patent issued to in fact go to a second generation process. That is to use the hemicellulose portion and convert that into ethanol as well. And you can see some of these, the write-up here that came out of the New York Times, and it was, it was a major, I think a major step in doing the second generation biofuels. In fact, this was, I think, the first significant step that we'd seen in terms of at least ethanol production. And this professor, Dr. Ingram at the University of Florida, created or designed a process using genetically engineered E. coli to convert the 5-sided sugars, the pentose fraction, into ethanol, which I thought was a significant development. And many of the developments that have occurred since then were partly copied off something that he did. The third generation biofuels they use specially engineered energy crops such as microalgae. In fact, I think almost all of it is microalgae for biofuels. Now, the claim is unlike crop-based biofuels, they don't compete with food production, and they don't require farmland nor fresh water. The reality is, in fact, depending on how you do it, it could require all of that and much, 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 much more. I pointed out earlier that we had at one time, I think probably one of the largest microalgae farms in the world. And here's a photo of it, Cyanotech on the Big Island. Most of what you see here is Haematococcus pluvialis. It's a microalgae strain. And you can see here, in fact, this red and orange thing is, it's the second stage of the growth of, in fact, it's not any longer growing. It's being stressed out so that it can then produce astaxanthin, which is the product that they're trying to produce. It's not being used for bioenergy purposes, rather it's used for a high-valued nutraceutical process. The fourth generation biofuel would be one that produces sustainable energy while it's sequestering carbon dioxide. In fact, it'll be carbon negative instead of being carbon neutral. And I showed you, one example of that earlier, where we could produce biochar from biomass using a pyrolysis process, taking the bio-oil that comes out of that, using that for biofuel production, and then taking the char, putting that into the ground, and thereby sequestering carbon dioxide, at least for, I don't know how long it'll last, a century or so, okay, as some type of CO2 sequestering strategy. Okay, with that, I conclude this morning's session. I don't know whether I finished early or late or pretty much on time. I want to thank particularly, University of Sao Paulo, of course, but in particularly Dr. Swani Coelho and Dr. Jose Simoes Moriera and Vanessa, hiding back there, I think, for their, warm hospitality and for the great lunch yesterday. Okay, does anybody have any questions? And you're going to have to speak loud, slowly.
Hi.
Do we have a microphone? Oh, yeah, using the microphone. We don't have a traveling microphone anymore? Okay, we do have okay. Okay, we're going to have that question first, and then we'll do this one.
Hi.
What were the two rules? Loud and slowly.
Hi, I am from Colombia. My name is Natalia Cano. I have two questions. You showed LCA results for different technologies, renewable and non-renewable resources, and these results have the same boundary systems. For example, cradle to gate, gate to gate, I don't know. And the second question is about any application of industrial application of furfural or hydroxymethyl furfural generated in this process.
Okay. The first question dealt with a cradle-to-grave analysis, and Dr. Eric Larson is going to talk about exactly that tomorrow. So I'll leave that question to him. Okay. So you can ask the same question tomorrow, or Eric, if you want to answer it now, you can. You want to?
So if I understood the question, you were asking if the different cases were on the same basis, cradle to grave. Yeah. So that it was just whether it was a consistent. I think the question was whether it was a consistent comparison from one case to the next.
Which cases are we talking about?
I think it might have been your slide with Michael Wong's results for jet fuel. Yeah.
On which results?
The jet fuel?
Oh, yes, yes, they were all on the same basis. I'm sorry. So it was
So
a question for
it
me.
has to be on the same basis to be
Yeah.
a fair analysis,
Yeah.
yeah.
And, okay, the second question dealt with, I'm sorry, she had one more second question. Yeah, what was the second question? Slowly, loudly.
Do you know the any application of industrial application for furfural and hydroxymethyl furfural generate into the process in the pretreatment process by gasification, for example?
Okay, and if I understood the question, it dealt with hydrogen into, oh, other applications for like gasification or something like? Oh yeah, in fact, that's part of the problem. There are much more attractive applications for almost everything we do than for energy usage. So we're forced to compete with just about every use. You know, if you took a look at, for example, bioproducts, which I'll spend a little bit of time on tomorrow, this afternoon, those are much more lucrative than bioenergy. So, you know, we have to compete with those all the time. You mentioned, for example, furfural production, or someone did, and you know, that's another end use. Thank God the worldwide market for that is fairly modest, so not much of it has been converted, but the value of the end product is much higher than, say, gasoline or anything like that that we could produce. So we're always competing with various end uses, but there are so many different things we can produce using, you know, all of these technologies. For example, when we looked at biomass gasification, the first thing that we were looking at was producing, in fact, ammonia, not even transportation fuels.
Hi, my name is Christina. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I was a bit surprised to find out that Hawaii exports the waste over such a long distance. And I wanted to ask whether the government is planning to invest more in recycling, waste incineration, because this is also a very important source of energy.
Yeah, thank you. The slide I showed was a plan. It never happened. Okay. So we never shipped off 100,000 tons.
Okay.
I guess the threat of doing that and the expense of doing that changed our practices. And so today, in the last 10 years, all of our garbage has now been kind of shifted. We have complete sorting of all our garbage. So every week I have to sort my garbage out into combustibles, which goes to our garbage to energy plant, into green waste, which goes into composting, and then finally all our recyclables, which are recycled. So from a residential standpoint, almost none of it goes into the landfill, and that has reduced the amount of, or the increase in landfill requirements for some time. Having said that, we do have a problem. Right now, our landfill, our present one, is under an EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, I forgot what you call it, but basically we are not in compliance. The Environmental Protection Agency has told us, in fact, that we have to shut down our landfill, and we don't have any place to go. So we do have significant problems. You're right. I mean, the government needs to step in and do something, and they're trying. Yeah. I think we're back in compliance now in terms of our landfill.
Thank you.
Aloha, Professor. Thank you for the lecture. My name is Dagon Ribeiro. I'm from Brasilia, the University of Brasilia. I work with microalgae. So the question is relate, have some integrate system about the like different industry, like for first generation, the like microalgae generation, like integrates make a lot of ethanol biofuel production, ethanol production, together with microalgae production, like using like CO2 and water. Have some kind of example like in how I like that?
Yeah, thank you. If I understood your question correctly about the integration of microalgae with other uses, yes. Not so much the applications that you talked about, but of course, wastewater treatment has always been one option that they've talked about. And something that I'll show a little later as one of the projects I gave my class was not quite dual application in terms of different fuels, but taking solar radiation, splitting it up. As I showed, only the power fraction can go into, can be photosynthesized. And that's only half of the energy. The other energy that's below a certain wavelength and above a certain wavelength really can't go towards biomass production. So the idea here is you have solar energy coming in, you split it using filters or other things into the power fraction and the non-power fraction, using the power fraction for microalgae production, and then using the non-power fraction for other uses, such as in photovoltaics and so on. So you produce algae and you produce electricity. And there have been other uses, but energy use is about the lowest valued use for almost anything. So as soon as we start looking at other applications for microalgae, what happens is that becomes the only use.
My question is also regarding the algae, because we know that we have like a very high cost with the cultivation, and then it's like a wet biomass, it has to be dried. So I just wanted to know like your perspective, like according to your experience, do you think that we are going to have ever have like a very established and with competitive price for liquid fuels, or algae is going to go like for the chemicals market? What's your opinion?
And that's a very good question. And a lot of people have talked about the extremely high yield potential of algae, pretty much reaching the photosynthetic efficiencies that I talked about, 110 tons per hectare a year or something like that, 3 times as much as we could get out of any land-based biomass. I've never seen that, commercially. Today, the biggest problem with the oleochemical pathway, that is oil to jet fuel or biofuel pathway, is the high cost of the feedstock. And algae is probably the worst of all of them in terms of dollars per gram or kilogram of oil. It's very expensive. The yields might be great, but the cost of production is very high. Now, I don't want this to be public, but I'll say it anyway. At one time, someone asked an expert, someone who actually was doing research in microalgae, at what point will microalgae become competitive with, as a biofuel feedstock? He said, when oil costs are $1,000 a barrel. So, when you have people who are doing research in that area being somewhat optimistic, I'm not real optimistic, but who knows? Certainly, microalgae has the potential of having extremely high yields. Many people have given a number of reasons. They don't have, a root structure that they need to support and so on. But producing microalgae is not easy. It's probably a lot easier to talk about it than do it. No.
Hello, my name is Larissa. Thank you very much for your presentation. And regarding fourth generation biofuels, Do you think that the CO2 from fermentation, in the case of sugar cane, for example, can be used for fuels, or the CO2 from the combustion of the bagasse? Do you see this as a future?
Okay. The answer would be no. I don't see how, at least from the standpoint of CO2, extracting energy out of CO2, you can't extract energy out of CO2 because it's at the lowest, it's at the ground state in terms of the energy pyramid. Again, you know, CO2 and H2 are at the bottom state. Now, our friend there who talked about microalgae, of course, you can always use CO2 as a feed for microalgae, and there in the process of photosynthesis, it will use the CO2. So that would be one example. And of course, any of the CO2 that goes into the atmosphere is taken up by plant materials, so it is used in a sense for generating energy, but not in a real explicit manner. It's always kind of in an indirect manner.
Yeah, just mean like power to gas or power to fuels, that you use the CO2 and then together with hydrogen you can produce methane or other synthetic fuels. So
Okay. Okay.
in this kind of way that I mean.
I guess you could. I mean, that, you know, much of what you're talking about is kind of reversing the direction of what we are trying to do right now. So, yes, all chemical reactions are reversible. So, you know, whatever you did to get to CO2 can be reversed. But I don't see that commercially making much sense. But who knows? No, I don't know that much about that. Mani has a question.
If I may try to participate in the discussion, just to make a comment on CO2 recycling. We have a few experiences now in Brazil. The easiest one is, of course, to capture CO2 from fermentation and to use it in soft drinks industry. This is already being done in several parts of Brazil. The second one is the use for other industries. We have some experiences in Paraná State, a sugar ethanol mill. They are selling CO2 for an industry to produce sodium carbonate. And then, of course, you capture the CO2. And also, in the same region, they are selling CO2 for greenhouse to grow plants and to grow wood. And then use also the CO2. So there are a few experiences that we are having now. So we could put together CO2 capture, and then, of course, Eric is going to talk about that tomorrow with much more competence, but just to give a few experiences that we have in Brazil. Thank you.
Yeah, just, you know, it's a side story, but much of the research I did before or during the time I was working on bioenergy had nothing to do with bioenergy. In fact, it was on CO2 sequestration. And there we looked at carbon dioxide coming out of power plants, liquefying it, and while this might sound disgusting to many people who are strict environmentalists, discharging it into the deep ocean, where we were hoping that it would be trapped pretty much forever. Because as all of you know, the oceans are a sink for CO2. What we wanted to do was just accelerate the process a lot more, and maybe have it tied up as CO2 clathrates, as ice structures at the bottom of the ocean.
Hello. Hello, my name is Diana. I'm from Colombia. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just wondering which are the problems regarding to the hardiness in your country, because, for example, here in Brazil we burn the cane, but it's not illegal, but happen like accidents in the field. In South Africa they have big problems from them because they have in large scale, so they have problems with the mountains. They don't have like industrialized like make machines for cut. and they have problems because they have a manual cutting, and they have like a mamba negra on this kind of species that you can find. I just wonder which problems do you have with harvest, maybe with the fauna that you find it, and I don't know if you have enough people for cut because it's a hard work. I don't know. It's just a curiosity.
Okay. If you're talking specifically about something like sugarcane, you know, Hawaii has the highest labor rates in the United States. Our laborers and people get paid more than anybody else in the United States. So we can't afford to do anything manually. Everything has to be automated. Our harvesting ever since World War II has all been done mechanically. Nobody cut cane, you know, by hand as they might in, I think in Brazil it's all mechanized too, right?
Here, we started with the state of São Paulo. Now we have 100 of our sugarcane mechanically harvested without burning. And the other states like Goiás and Mato Grosso do Sul already starting to be mandatory, the harvesting with machines. Only in Northeast, we have the manual harvesting and the burning, because there we have, similar as she said, the sugarcane plantations are in small hills, so the slope is too high, and then the machine cannot work on that. So, but in Northeast is only 20% of the sugarcane in the country.
Yeah.
But it's more or less probably the same situation you mentioned in some areas in Colombia. Because of the slope, the machines cannot work, so you have to make it manually.
Yeah.
Is that so?
Yeah, in Hawaii, the labor rates, again, are so high that we can't do anything manually. There are very few crops or anything that we can do by hand. Everything has to be mechanized.
Hi, Professor.
Yes.
André from Brazil, and I want to question you about the energy used for the biomass that you showed today. When I say energy use, I say to make electricity. See, we do have a lot of sites and plants here that use biomass from pinus or from eucalyptus. And I want to know if the use of for energy maybe increase or maybe become more sophisticated by using, for instance, microalgae. If we do achieve a better efficiency, like we are limited by Carnot when we are using this kind of Rankine cycles or Brighton cycles, but I know that the U.S. Department of Energy are trying to use CO2 as a working fluid, so to become more efficient, or using fuel cells that doesn't the Carnot limit doesn't apply to this kind of technology. So do you think that, okay, maybe if we reach higher efficiency to convert this kind of chemical energy in electricity, it could be, you know, instead I have a forest, I could have a building with a lot of microalgae, and then remove, for instance, the cost of transportation of the biomass to the power plant. Do you think that it could be possible?
Okay, I don't know all of the question that you asked, but certainly in terms of improving our efficiency, I'm only going to talk about those that are related to bioenergy. Okay. You're right. I think I showed a slide there in which we have looked in the past at producing hydrogen from biomass and then using that in a fuel cell, as you probably know. You know, whereas all of the cycles that I talked about, the Rankine and the Brayton cycle, the steam turbine and the gas turbine cycles, they're all restricted or capped by the second law of thermodynamics. If you go into a fuel cell, it isn't restricted the same way. So whereas the maximum efficiency I could ever get in any kind of heat engine like you saw there would be the Carnot efficiency, with a fuel cell, I'm not restricted by that. I could actually get much higher efficiencies than that. So we have looked at fuel cell technologies, but all of those things are very costly. The technologies that we have in place right now, the boiler steam generator / gas turbine system, steam turbine system is, it's 100 years old, and it works very, very well. Some of these others have the potential of much higher efficiency, just as Dr. Coelho talked about the possibility of doing second generation biofuels. Just making that bridge to get there is very difficult. So we haven't been able to make much improvements in using better strategies that might be more promising beyond those technologies that we have right now. I don't. That's it? Okay.